Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about books that provoke conversation and conversations about books. Every episode, we sit down to chat about the 2 books read most recently by our book clubs. What did we make of them? Did they spark debate? And whether we loved them or loathed them, the big question always is, were they great book club books?
Our 2 books this month are last year's Man Booker International Prize winner, The Vegetarian by Kang, and the wildly successful bestseller from a while back, The Reader by Bernhard Schlink. We'll also hear from science journalist and broadcaster Sue Nelson, who told me about the difficulties of actually getting yourself involved in a book club when you move to a new area.
We'd moved from North London, so didn't really know anybody. And when I kept asking, do you have a book club? Oh, is it open to everyone? I just got, no, it's just the 4 of us, or it's just the 6 of us, and it's very much a friends group.
All that coming up right here on the Book Club Review.
So here we are, back in the garden shed again, and we've had a few warmer days, but today is very cold. It feels like a good day for cozying up with a thick blanket and a good book.
Let's start off with The Vegetarian.
So, The Vegetarian is a slim novel from South Korea, published in Korean in 2007, and then it was translated by Deborah Smith and published by Picador in the UK in 2015. And it won the International Man Booker Prize last year and shot to attention. It was suddenly a book people were talking about. And Natalie in my book club had read it and really loved it, so offered it up for something that she thought might make a good book for us to read. It tells the story of a young South Korean woman called Yeong-hye who has a recurring nightmarish dream, and as a result she decides to stop eating meat. And in the context of the novel, this is shown to be an act that's very much against the codes and conventions of how a young married woman should behave in Korean society. The story is told from 3 different points of view. So we hear from Yeong-hye's husband, who's called Mr. Cheong, who is mainly just embarrassed and appalled by what he perceives to be his wife's unraveling mental state. The second part is narrated by her brother-in-law, who is a video artist, who becomes sexually obsessed with her after he hears about a small birthmark she has on her body. And then the end of the novel, the third part, is seen from her sister's point of view. And it's then that we really start to get some insight into her childhood, her background, and why Yeong-hye might want to escape her body and her life.
I found this 3-part structure extremely effective and satisfying. What kept me interested in one respect was I wondered whether or not we were ever going to find out the story from Yeong-hye's perspective. But actually, Kang doesn't do that for the readers. We're always learning about Yeong-hye's story from other people's perspective.
And it felt to me significant that we never really hear her own thoughts. You get tiny fragments of them when she considers the dreams that she's having, but that's the only moment at which you ever really get to hear her inner voice. We only ever see her through others' eyes. And with that comes all the judgments that they make about her, which is partly what makes her such a fascinating focal point, because through her, we see not only her own story as it unfolds, but we also see Korean society and people's expectations and judgments and their actions. And it's very revealing about perhaps not just Korean society, but human beings and how we all interact and have codes of behavior and what happens when someone does something outside of that.
Yes, because as a Western reader, the vegetarianism isn't in any way shocking, but it's quite a subversive act for a relatively young woman, I think she's in her late 20s perhaps, to make this decision in Korean culture and to stand by this decision in the face of strong opposition from her husband and her father. And there's this very dramatic, violent scene from Mr. Chong's perspective where the family has gathered together to have a meal. What happens is that her father decides that she must eat meat. He forces her brother and brother-in-law to hold her while he tries to force meat into her mouth.
And I had actually underlined a little bit because we're perhaps making it sound very bleak, and it's true that it is. It's bleak and it's visceral, it's a very sensual book, but actually it can be quite funny, and particularly the character of Mr. Chong, who narrates the first part, just because he's so awful. So there's a dramatic scene where she's fought her way free of her family and grabbed a knife and slit her wrists, and actually the brother-in-law is the one person in the scene who isn't paralysed at that point, and leaps into action and binds her wrists and picks her up and says to the husband, "Someone, fetch a towel, someone call a taxi, we need to get her to hospital." And Mr. Chong says, "I groped for my shoes. The ones I picked up weren't a pair, so I had to swap them before I was able to open the front door and go out." And that just sums him up. Everything about him is to do with propriety and convention.
I found him to be a little bit of a caricature and, entirely unsympathetic, but that bothered me a little bit. I wanted him to seem a bit more human. I didn't want him to seem to be such a stereotype.
Yeah, it's true. One of the things I think makes the novel very interesting to think about is she walks a very kind of complex path between mental illness on the one hand and conscious action on the other. And it's quite hard to tell when Yeong-hye is acting in her mind logically because of traumas that she's experienced that she wants to escape, or just a general sense of oppression and control by the people around her and society in general, and she just wants to seize back some power over her body, and mental illness where she is not really able to control her thoughts and her actions. And I think some people in my book club enjoyed that and found that really interesting and were able to empathize. But for some people, it was very hard to connect with her because of that.
That's interesting. That didn't occur to me, and that doesn't reflect my reading of the book.
I think there's a question about the feminism in the book. To me, it felt very clearly a feminist text. This is about a female character who is objectified. She's controlled, going from little things like her refusal to wear a bra because she finds it uncomfortable. Mr. Chong is absolutely appalled and also incidentally aroused when he discovers that she's routinely not wearing a bra. But it's the conventions that he's upset about and what society will think. So little things like simply refusing to wear a bra to her desire to control her own body. And even that is, she is always denied power over her own body.
And you haven't mentioned that Mr. Chong might be slightly humorous, but he very violently rapes his wife when she has stopped having sex with him. And then we haven't even got to the second section where it's from the perspective of the brother-in-law, this struggling contemporary video artist.
Yeah, how do you talk about the sex?
How did you talk about the sex?
Well, so the second part of the novel is highly erotically charged. He is obsessed with her body because he hears about this small mark that she has on her skin. He becomes completely taken over by the idea of painting flowers on her skin. And she, in turn, because she has this subconscious desire to become a plant, is actually surprisingly open to the idea of him painting her body. And again, it's a very fine line between consent and the degree to which she is willingly opening herself up to what he's asking to do, and him forcing himself upon her.
Every section in the book is told from the perspective of one individual. That's the nature of first-person narration. So we are only told about her consent through the eyes of the brother-in-law. We're saying brother-in-law because he's never named throughout the book. Her long silences no longer bothered him. He thought he'd figured out by now that they generally signified consent.
Yeah.
This is wildly problematic.
Yeah. There was a passage I wanted to read. "Lie on your side for me." Slowly, as though timing her movements to some music only she could hear, she bent her arms, legs and waist and rolled onto her side. He panned the camera down the ridge of her side and over the soft curve of her buttocks, and then filmed first the flowers on her back, the flowers of night, and then the flowers of the sun on her front. Once he'd finished this, he moved on to her Mongolian mark, faint like some blue relic in the gradually fading light. He hesitated. He'd promised himself he wouldn't do this. But as she gazed over at the pitch-black window, he couldn't stop himself taking a close-up of her face. The screen filled with her pale lips, the shadowed hollow above her protruding collarbones, her forehead with her dishevelled hair, and her 2 empty eyes.
I'm glad you read that, because it is. I've read examples, some quotes that show his problematic view of Yeong-hye, and at the same time there's a lot of beauty and appreciation in how he describes her. And when they do eventually consummate this sort of vision on video, it's quite lovely, even as you're quite uncomfortable, because this is a woman who seems to be suffering from extreme mental illness.
I found the writing absolutely beautiful and the images incredibly powerful, but at the same time I was so troubled by his actions, and I'm very judgmental about that. We should talk about the translation, because it's quite an interesting story. Deborah Smith is a young translator. The Vegetarian was the first book that she translated. She had read it in Korean and really liked it and thought it would be something that might be of interest in the UK market, and a publisher commissioned it. But Kang also speaks English, and so when Deborah Smith sent her the translation, Kang was able to respond to it. She was able to read it and understand it and respond to it, and I think that led to a very interesting collaboration between the two of them, where they were able to work very closely on the nuances of the text, the meaning. And if you watch a video of Kang talking about the book online, there's a real precision to the way that she speaks. She weighs her words very carefully. And I absolutely felt that came through in the translation and the writing. There was a real sense of how she thinks, how she writes, how she speaks. It was all a very holistic, quite successful for me, use of language. I thought it was beautiful.
So the big question, was it a good book club book?
It was a very good book club book, mainly because it was so divisive. Some people loved the beauty of the writing and empathized with the character and enjoyed the story. Others felt very differently. Some people really just didn't get on with it at all and were quite surprised that it had been as successful as it was. So in terms of discussion, it was excellent, because everyone had so much to say. Only one other person confessed, as I did, that they found it erotic, which maybe that was just me. But
I think it's undeniably erotic, and everyone was just being a bit British.
Yeah.
It's my hypothesis. All right, well, the consensus seems to be a brilliant book club book. Some people may love it, some people may hate it, but it will lead to conversation.
Still to come, our review of Bernhard Schlink's The Reader. But first, it's time for our regular nose around other book clubs aside from our own. And this time, I caught up with Sue Nelson, a journalist who moved from busy North London to a quiet Hertfordshire village with her family. She was keen to join a book club to make new friends, but found it wasn't easy breaking into the established groups, and so she decided simply to start a new one. And here's how she did it.
It began with no one knowing anyone at all. I just put up a few notices on the parish council boards around the village, sort of outside. I put one in the library, basically just saying, would anybody like to join a book club? That's how it started, because I tried, but we'd moved from North London, so didn't really know anybody. And when I kept asking, do you have a book club? Oh, is it open to everyone? I just got, no, it's just the 4 of us, or it's just the 6 of us, and it's very much a friends group, which is why I then went out of my way to make it as open as possible for everyone.
And so was it hard to find those members initially, or did you find that people were quite keen to join a new book club?
I mean, we're a small book club. There's a core lot of 4 or 5 of us, sometimes 6, and that number has stayed stable really over the 13 years.
And so when you meet, what are the mechanics of it?
Well, I was very keen not to make it all about me. I do organise it. I send the emails out. I remind people. I let them know of the books we've chosen. But I wanted it to be as egalitarian as possible, because everybody has different tastes. We've now reached the point where we're actually doing usually 2 books each month, because one wasn't enough. So say that the 2 were my selection, or one of the 2, then I'll try and make sure that actually the next time it's someone else's choice, so that no one feels, I never do what I like.
So when you get together, you're discussing, more often than not, you're discussing not 1 but 2 books.
Yeah, and that has worked really well. Sometimes not everyone's got time to actually read both of them, and that's fine. So we might say 1 or both. A lot of the time, most people do read both. It depends. Our age range is probably spans 30 years or so. And that I think is important too, so that we don't always do the same style of books. And we're not always doing the sort of books that we all remember from our childhood, or because everybody's got a slightly different background and history, and everyone's from different areas as well. They're not all sort of Hertfordshire born.
And how do you choose those books? Do people come with suggestions and then you choose for the next meeting?
Yeah. People tend to tear newspapers apart because they've cut out a little book review from the Sunday paper or something. Or they might have heard something on Radio 4 or have been in Waterstones and just picked something up and said, oh, that looks good. So it can vary, but everyone usually has suggestions on what they want to do. And that's what makes it quite successful, because we do try to vary the genres as well, so that we don't read all contemporary, we don't read all classical. And that's a key, I think. When I've talked to other people who've got book clubs, when they've heard, because you always swap, if you meet someone in a book club, we say, oh, what have you done recently? And that's a great help to find what worked, what didn't. And often I've heard from other book club members that what hasn't worked so well is that they've done the same style of books. If they're all into thrillers, they do practically thrillers every month. And so when they've heard that, say, for example, we did Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, which admittedly it took me 12 years to get the book club to try fantasy. But when they did, they loved it. It's a fantastic book. And it was the first time I'd ever read a Neil Gaiman as well. And that, to me, is what makes it, is when we've had a night where we've done an author or a genre that one or two of us perhaps has been a bit sniffy about, or is like, oh, I wouldn't normally read this. And we come away saying, well, I love that. I didn't expect that. That was fantastic, because you feel enriched by it and you sort of leave with a bit of a spring in your step. And you also feel as if your brain's had a little bit of a spring clean, because while it's great to, and I do the same, I might binge read certain thrillers, trying to think, Only Child and all that. I have they're not trash books, but they're I can eat them like sweets, just stuff them in your mouth without even actually considering them. It's great to actually sometimes just do that and then take your time and then have to perhaps think a little bit harder about certain books. It's good for the palate.
It is. I think that's absolutely true. I think left to our own devices, we readers follow our impulses, but we tend to choose things that we know we're going to like. Why would you choose to read something you don't think you're going to like? And that's what a book club does. It will get you to read something that maybe you would never have looked at, and you make these great discoveries.
Absolutely. I've always liked quite old-fashioned science fiction books like H.G. Wells, and I was a huge fan of Jack Finney. And he's always this author that most people go, Jack who? He wrote one of the most famous sci-fi films, actually, or it was based on his book around, which is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But he's obsessed with time travel. And he'd written a book called Time and Again, which I'd read in the 90s. I was living in New York at the time, and they had most fantastic bookshops, which we've got now, but in the UK you didn't have at that time these huge bookstores with sofas and cafes. It was just a revelation to me, and that was where I found out about Jack Finney, because at that time his book had not left the New York bestseller lists for something like 18 years. I mean, it was amazing. So I suggested it for the book group just because I had loved it, and that for me was a personal thrill and delight that everyone else loved it, but not all of them have been as successful.
So is there something that you can think of that was a bit of a disastrous book club book?
The first one, in fact, I didn't know what to choose for it to be the first book, so I did a bit of online research, and there's a book by Mitch Albom called The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, and it said this is a great book for book club. So I thought, okay, and that was what I'd put up on the notice that I'd put round, saying this is what we'll do as the first book. So a short book, I thought, perfect if you're starting one up. And everyone hated it except me. And they didn't just hate it. They were so rude And so, which is funny looking back, so forthright, to the point that was saying, well, you'd have to be really puerile if you like this sort of rubbish, that sort of thing. And I was like, well, actually, I liked it. So, and I came home, and my husband reminds me, I came home and I said, that's it. It was a disaster. Nobody's going to come back. We decided on a second book, but I said, that's it. It won't work. But here I am 13 years later, and thankfully it's still going.
Well, it's impressive because remember, these were not people that you knew at all, were they? These were effectively strangers.
Which made it worse in a way because they don't know you and have a sort of confidence in you that, say, friends would have, saying, okay, she might have got it wrong this time, but maybe it will be okay the next time. But I do think, in a way, a successful book club meeting is not one that everyone likes it, because they can be the ones where people say the least. They just go, yeah, I loved it. Oh, yeah. And then there's like silence. So actually the best evenings we've had have either been where the book is so superb, like the one All the Light We Cannot See, or The Book Thief. We were all stunned by them, and we couldn't stop talking about how magnificent the writing was, the story, the characters. The other most enjoyable type of book club is where one person or one or two has really not enjoyed it and the others have, because then you have this great discussion. Yeah, they're fun.
I couldn't agree with Sue more. The best book clubs are always the ones where you have two camps with violently opposing opinions of the book, and the discussion is warm, kind, but equally you're going after one another. And the result is usually you appreciate the book more than you did at the beginning. No matter how much you loved it, it's helpful to understand why other people might have disliked it.
Absolutely. And she also follows my own inclination in that she prefers to mix it up. I think you do that with your book club as well, where you'll vary the genre of what you're reading.
Genre, fiction to non-fiction, many different types of books. That's the ideal.
It was interesting her saying how difficult it was to get them to read fantasy. They read Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, which I have to say I've never read. Why are people so resistant to fantasy as a genre?
I'm thinking about that because I'm a massive fantasy reader, and I've decided that fantasy is for me what thrillers and crime are for other people. So many readers I know love crime novels, love thrillers. I can't stand them. I don't understand why anyone would want to read them. Those same people probably feel exactly the same about fantasy. And I think it's because both genres are genre fiction. They have certain conventions, and the more familiar you are with those conventions, the more you sort of enjoy them. It's like a warm hug. You know what to expect.
I was trying to thinking about my own book club, if we'd ever read any fantasy, and I couldn't actually think of anything. No, I don't think we've ever done fantasy, so I may well propose that we read Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere.
Ooh, he's written better books. I've read everything by Neil Gaiman. I'd recommend American Gods over Neverwhere.
Okay, good. I'll remember that. And have you ever heard of Jack Finney? I never had. That was totally new to me.
I haven't, but I have heard of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I've heard of Time and Again. And while I don't read as much science fiction as I read fantasy, I'd quite like to explore him.
I love that, though, because to me that sums it up. That's why conversations about books are such fun, because everyone you meet has their own personal lexicon of books that they've read, books that are meaningful for them.
Different authors who they insist you must read, and then suddenly there's 10 novels by an author you've never read, and you get to work your way through all of them.
Exactly. Connections between writers, different genres. When you discuss things, just in a casual conversation with somebody, you get to find out about all that.
Ultimately, that's why we're here, Kate.
It's what book club conversations are all about. Well, thanks very much to Sue Nelson for that interview. And if you're interested, Sue actually makes an award-winning podcast herself called Space Boffins, which is available through iTunes or through her website, boffinmedia.co.uk. And finally, we turn to Bernhard Schlink's The Reader. Few can forget Kate Winslet's Oscar-winning performance opposite Ralph Fiennes in the 2008 film The Reader. But did the character of Hannah come to life as effectively for Laura's book club when they read Bernhard Schlink's original novel? Laura, tell us about the book and why your book club chose to read it.
So we always have a discussion at the end of every book club what we should read next. Because we'd read Hillbilly Elegy, we wanted to read fiction again, and Lisa, who's from Germany, from Berlin, suggested we read The Reader by Bernhard Schlink, which was written in German and has been translated into English. It was a wildly successful bestseller, 500,000 copies in Germany, and top of the New York Times bestseller list. It was also picked for Oprah's book club in February 2009, so that pushed the sales up dramatically in the US.
Apparently it's quite unusual for Germans to really take to heart a book by a German author. And one of the significant things about Bernhard Schlink was that it was a homegrown German novel, and it did fantastically well, and then it went on to do really well internationally. But I thought that was quite interesting.
Well, Lisa actually couldn't attend the book group where we discussed the reader in the end, and that was a shame. However, a new edition, Charlie, has a degree in German literature, which was very handy, because he could explain to us that the reader was one of a number of books that came out in the early 90s that dealt with the post-war generation seeking to reconcile, the history of their loved ones and their lives during World War II and the Holocaust. And there's a word for this, because of course the Germans have a word for everything, which is very long, and I'm looking at it now, and I'm going to try and say it, but it's going to be very bad. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And that roughly translates as the struggle to come to terms with one's past. So the reader sits firmly within that movement in German literature.
And so, do you want to talk about the story? What happens?
It's another first-person narration. Our narrator is Michael Berg, and he's recounting the events that began when he was 15 at a much later date. So at the age of 15, he comes down with hepatitis, and as his symptoms are just coming to the fore, and he's vomiting in a side street, a woman, much older than him, comes out and helps him wash up and then takes him home. When he recovers a few months later, his mum suggests that he go back with some flowers and thank the woman for her help on that day. And so he returns and he meets Hannah. And so there's this immediate attraction for this young 15-year-old boy to this older woman. And they have this sexual relationship over the course of 4 to 6 months. It's a bit unclear. After school, he goes and meets her. They share a bath. He comes to read to her, and then they have sex. And this is a routine that goes forward for over this set period of time.
And he's still living at home with his parents at this point.
And no one knows about this except him. And what's interesting, I don't know if you've read this, but apparently what came up when Oprah interviewed him right away was this idea that this is child abuse, because he's 15 years old and Hannah is 36 years old. And apparently this had never occurred to the author, but it was one of the first things that came to my mind. And the narrator himself never seems to see it as abuse or that he was taken advantage of, even though this relationship, for many reasons, will impact his entire life and how he perceives and relates to other people.
Yes, because she definitely takes the dominant role in that relationship. She really, more so than him, is the one who initiates things and encourages him. And
encourages him, and if he steps out of line in any way, he's a young 15-year-old boy, she very much puts him back into his place, even to the extent where at some moments she's violent, and there's a point where she slaps him across the face with a belt.
Yeah, so it's troubling.
It is troubling. And then it becomes more troubling because she disappears without a trace. He continues on in his life, but he's aware that he isn't fully engaging with other people. There's a numbness has begun to set in. And then the next time he sees Hannah, she is in the dock, in a courtroom. He's a young legal student, and his class had been assigned to attend a trial for female guards at Auschwitz, who were then also at a smaller camp in Krakow. And Hannah was one of those guards. Michael has a slow revelation, which is that Hannah, the reason why she's had him read to her, the reason why she had prisoners in the Krakow camp read to her, was because she is illiterate.
And she goes to extraordinary lengths to conceal this fact, doesn't she? That's one of the things I found so hard to understand, was the degree to which she was obsessed with covering up this fact that she couldn't read.
It was useful because one of the members of my book group explained that this actually is very typical behavior for people who cannot read. It becomes such a secret. They are so mortified by this secret that they will do everything in their power not to let anyone know about their illiteracy. For that reason, she can't defend herself properly because she can't admit to certain things.
And there's an interesting question of scapegoating, isn't there? There's a sense that they want to pin the blame on someone. She is there. She is acknowledging culpability, even if she wasn't entirely responsible for the events. Nonetheless, she admits she was there. She was part of it. And she turns to the judge at one point and asks him, "What would you have done?"
And that's the question of the book. I think that's the question that this movement in German literature was trying to answer for the post-war generation, is what would you have done? What troubles me about this book is Hannah doesn't need to be illiterate to ask these questions. And I've read other reviews of the book, and they flag this illiteracy as problematic because does it make her any less culpable as a human being for the crime she commits? I don't think so. To me, it's almost a bit irrelevant. She can't defend herself in court as effectively as she might because she hasn't been able to read the evidence. But to me, it's slightly irrelevant. I mean, she was there. She was a capable human being, and she chose not to unlock the doors. And her illiteracy doesn't make a difference. What does it matter?
Well, I just could never get past the fact of her illiteracy, but also that she was never able to overcome that. Why didn't she just learn to read? And the reason I found that so hard to understand is because she is someone who is passionate about books. She is a passionate reader. First of all, she gets Michael to read to her, and then she gets prisoners to read to her. She loves books. Then she's incarcerated for a long period of time. And again, reading is the thing that keeps her going, but she has to have people read to her, or Michael makes her audio tapes and she listens to things. But she's a passionate reader. She just can't read. And I could understand someone who wasn't really that interested in reading not being able to read and living with that fact, but I could never really get my head around the idea that someone who was a passionate reader wouldn't just sit down one day and say, you know what, I'm going to try and figure this out.
And the way she does is by listening to Michael's recordings and taking the books out from the library and reading them, scanning the words against what Michael is saying, and that's how she teaches herself to read.
Let's talk about the translation a little bit. I have to say I hated the translation of this book. It really grated on me. I didn't like the Americanisms. I hated the way that Hannah calls Michael kid.
All the time.
All the time. And it really interfered with my enjoyment of the story.
I wonder if the translation is to blame for the slightly leaden prose. Now, that may be unfair to the translator because I haven't read enough German fiction to have an understanding of the conventions of German literature and how that might show up in an English translation. But this is a book with a very dramatic relationship, with dramatic twists and turns, and yet I was fairly unmoved throughout. And I couldn't understand this relationship between Hannah and Michael because the narrator is telling us about the love and the happiness despite everything, and it meant nothing to me. I didn't believe in it.
Yeah, I felt the same. I felt it was better when he was on legal grounds. He actually trained as a lawyer, and I liked it best when it was dealing with the courtroom scenes and judicial procedures, and that to me was really interesting. At that point, the careful use of language and the slightly unemotional prose made sense, and there was a clarity there that I enjoyed.
My friend and colleague Afi, who is a writer herself, is part of my book club group, and she's great because she'll always play devil's advocate, even if she didn't like the book that much herself. And when I said that I felt it was quite wooden in its prose, that I didn't feel emotionally engaged, she pointed out that there is a theme of numbness, and the numbness that descends on people who have been victims of war crimes, well, victims in general, potentially also perpetrators. And Michael, the narrator, kind of dances around this. He doesn't want to, in any way, to say that victims and perpetrators within the camps were similar, but that there might have been a similarity in their numbness. How do humans react? How do they live in such circumstances?
Yeah, that's interesting. But I think if I believed in the book more, and if he had been able to get me to emotionally connect with the characters more and taken me more into that world through better writing, I would be more inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt and appreciate that quality of numbness, which I think she's right. I think it is an interesting element to this book.
So Afi, having opened my eyes to the fact that this might be a deliberate decision on the author's part to kind of create a numbness in the copy itself, Afi then backtracked and said, yeah, it kind of reads like spark notes of the reader. You know, you can imagine it as a summary of a much more complex, moving novel, and yet this is the novel we're given.
I have to say also, I read this book when it first came to fame. I think it's been many years since I read it, maybe 10 years or so. But I have to say, I did not remember one word of it.
Well, it's funny you say that because Frances, another member of my book club, said she'd forgotten that Hannah was illiterate. She's like, I read it years ago. It's called The Reader, and yet somehow I couldn't remember the central twist in the plot.
But so to me, that's a kind of sad evidence of the fact that it doesn't really worm its way into your heart. It doesn't really fundamentally change the way you feel about anything. To me, it's what I hope to find in a book is something that's going to really change the way I think, and characters that are going to live on in my mind. And I have to say, purely from experience, not necessarily from any intention on my part, this did not stay with me.
And yet, it was a great book club book.
Oh yes, good point, because it makes for good discussion.
It made for a great discussion. Not because anyone liked it, but because with a first-person narrator, there's so many ways you can interpret what's happening. And although some people liked it a bit more than me, it was pretty muted. And we didn't get into great discussions about answering Hannah's question, what would you do? We didn't really get into that. And yet at the same time, there was a lot to kind of talk around the relationship between Michael and Hannah, Michael's understanding of that relationship, which doesn't seem to change, even as he's much older. I think he's probably in his 50s when he's recounting the story, looking back at when he was 15. And yet Michael seems to have remained very, very much the same person.
Yeah, he doesn't particularly seem to grow or mature or develop in any way. So all in all, maybe not the best book to read, but a good book club book to discuss.
Yes, but if we had to pick between the two, I would recommend The Vegetarian. It's much more divisive, but it's much more beautifully written as well.
What to read next is always one of our favourite things to think about. Inspired by today's podcast, here are a few suggestions you might want to consider for your next book club read. As we've been thinking about Korea with The Vegetarian, my first recommendation is Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick. It's hard for any outsiders to really know what goes on in North Korea because it's an impenetrable dictatorship where the only access journalists have is to Pyongyang, where everything they see is carefully staged. Los Angeles Times journalist Barbara Demick solved the problem by interviewing people who had escaped North Korea and made new lives for themselves in China or South Korea. Their stories enabled Demick to reconstruct what life is like for those who live under the repressive governmental regime. Demick's writing is enthralling. Her stories are based on facts, but she brings them to life with a novelist's flair. There's plenty of interesting discussion to be had, not only over the content, but also about the mechanics of the book and the way Demick approached her subject. My next recommendation is another German author, Walter Kempowski, and the book is All for Nothing. It's January 1945, and the German army is retreating from the Russian advance. Close to the border, the wealthy von Globig family have to decide whether to flee or whether to stay in their manor house. Kempowski is well known in his native Germany, but has only recently been translated into English. He is an extraordinary writer, and this story is told in beautiful, haunting prose. The novel has the most extraordinary sense of place, and the characters come to life vividly before your eyes. But this is also a book that raises profound questions about what happens to ordinary people when they're caught up in global events. I think it would make an excellent book club book.
Similarly, following on from Bernhard Schlink's The Reader, I'd like to recommend two brilliant books by another German author, Robert Seethaler. The first is The Tobacconist, which was first published in 2012 and then translated by Charlotte Collins into English in 2016. It tells the story of 17-year-old Franz Huschel, who leaves his home on the banks of an Austrian lake and moves to Vienna in the months right before Anschluss. It's a coming-of-age story that involves Freud, no less, as a friendship blossoms between Franz and Freud, and they discuss women and life. But it's also a beautiful story about how good people react to events that are unfolding around them. And I found it so much more moving than The Reader because the story ends somewhat abruptly. I don't want to ruin it, but it's a story about how good people act in times of war and in times when the people around them are being persecuted and killed. And the reality is that story doesn't always end happily, and yet the behavior of those individuals can be very moving and very uplifting. The other novel by Robert Seethaler is A Whole Life, and it was published after The Tobacconist in 2014 in German, but translated before The Tobacconist into English. And it has been a runaway success. It was also nominated for the International Man Booker Prize, and it tells the story of one man's life as he's born into a small village in a valley in the Austrian Alps. And it's very short, but it, as you might expect from the title, A Whole Life, it covers everything that happens to him over the course, I think, of 4 or 5 decades, and it's very moving. Robert Sayteller is brilliant. Bernhard Schlink pales in comparison to him, and although I'm not entirely sure whether both books would make for good book club reads, possibly because I can't imagine anyone disliking these books, they're just so wonderful, they're very worthwhile, and I highly recommend them.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks very much for listening. If you've enjoyed our show, please subscribe. You'll find us on iTunes. We'd love to know what you think, so please leave us a review.
Next time, we'll be discussing Second-Hand Time by Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich and The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, a sci-fi feminist classic. Until then, happy reading!